We're going to be talking about a period of time known as the Era of Good Feelings, which more or less corresponds to the presidency of James Monroe. Here are your video goals. Make sure you can answer these questions. You know the drill. Alright, so the period of time from around 1816 to 1824, or perhaps 1817 to 1825, depending on which book you look at, was called the Era of Good Feelings. Now, why do historians call this time period this? There are two main reasons. The first reason is that Americans felt really good about themselves after not losing the War of 1812. Basically, they showed the world that they could stand up to Great Britain, who was at that time perhaps the strongest nation in the world, and so they thought they had proved themselves and now felt that they could stand up to Europe whenever they wanted to. Second, during this time period, there was only one major political party in the United States, the Republicans. And so having only one political party is important because it means there's not a big division between people. If you've ever heard a Republican and a Democrat argue with each other today, you know that that usually doesn't lead to people feeling good. So anyway, the reason there was only one political party at this time was that the Federalists became really unpopular after the War of 1812 because of the Hartford Convention and because some of them wanted to leave the country entirely. And after the War of 1812, they never won any major elections ever again. That meant that for a while, the Republicans seemed to represent the interests of most Americans. And this would continue for a while after this. There's a picture there of Americans feeling good about themselves. During the Era of Good Feelings was James Monroe. There's a picture of him there. He was generally considered to be a quiet and polite man. He had served under George Washington in the Revolutionary War, and he remained pretty popular throughout his 2 terms as president. There were 3 big things that he did during his presidency that we're going to talk about. First, he's considered to be a nationalist president. And what this means is that he focused on making the United States stronger and uniting the United States together, rather than representing our particular group or party. So he was a president for all of the United States, not just for the North or the South or whatever. Second, he oversaw American expansion. He helped America to stake a claim to the Oregon Territory, and he oversaw the American acquisition of Florida. And also during his term, many Americans went westward and started new states like Illinois and Indiana and stuff like that. And lastly, Monroe helped America to stand up to Europe, and he did this in a couple ways, but most famously with his Monroe Doctrine, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So first let's look at how America expands during Monroe's presidency. First, in 1818, America settles a deal with Britain where it gets to expand the Louisiana Purchase by a little bit. See that little purple area there on the map. It acquires that little bit of territory, really not very little, about the size of New York, and it also agrees that it's going to split the Oregon Territory, or rather share the Oregon Territory with Britain, and that they were going to work to control this area together for 10 years and then renegotiate. So this was the first step to the United States eventually acquiring the Northwest. Second, a year later, the United States ends up with Florida, and this is a bit complicated. Basically, the United States sends Andrew Jackson into Spanish-controlled Florida to attack some Indian tribes who were still kind of messing with U.S. citizens. So Jackson goes down there and he beats up some Indians, but he also, with no orders from the United States, conquers a bunch of Spanish forts and basically claims Spain for the United States. At first, Monroe doesn't know what to do, but he eventually decides to go ahead and go with Jackson's thing and claim the United States or claim Florida for the United States. So Spain, which is busy putting up with a whole bunch of other stuff going on in South America, doesn't really have time for this, and basically gives Florida to the United States. So Andrew Jackson, more or less on a whim, manages to acquire Florida for the United States. So not only is the U.S. gaining more territory, but also it's spreading out over this vast territory that it now controls. So if you look at that map there, the brown territories are the areas that the U.S. legally owns, but that where not very many Americans actually live yet. The pink territories represent states, and this map represents the states where people lived in 1825. And so the pink area here is a little bit bigger than the last thing we looked at, which was from 1812. And that's because during Monroe's presidency, hundreds and thousands of people are moving westward and settling down there. One reason for this is that after the War of 1812, it was a lot safer and easier to do this because the Native Americans who had lived there had been kicked out or killed. This movement west brings 5 new western states into the United States. That's Indiana and Illinois in the north, and then Missouri, Mississippi, and Alabama in the south. And this is going to lead to some serious issues later because there is an argument between the North and the South about whether these new states should be slave states or free states. And basically they'll work it out in the short term, but this issue is going to be the issue that eventually leads to the Civil War. So even during the era of good feelings, people are arguing about the issue of slavery. All right, and last of all, we have the Monroe Doctrine. And so we need to back up a little bit if we're going to understand the Monroe Doctrine. Basically, from 1810 to 1820, Mexico and many other colonized areas in Central and South America broke away from the European countries that were colonizing them. This is more or less the exact same thing that the United States did in 1776 when they broke away from the British. So basically, South American countries want to be independent just like the United States is independent. And the United States thinks that this is a good thing because we agree with democracy and freedom and stuff like that. But a lot of European nations don't like this, and some of them have plans to reclaim these territories and crush the democracies there. Spain and maybe France and some other European countries want to send people back there and reclaim this territory for Europe. Monroe didn't like this for a number of reasons. So in 1823, he issued something known as the Monroe Doctrine, which announced to Europe that, one, the Americas were no longer available for colonization. Basically, they were off limits. And two, that the United States would view any attempt at colonization as a direct threat against the United States. And so basically what this does is it tells Europe that the Americas, both North and South America, are off limits to them, and that basically it belongs to the United States and the other independent nations in South America. And this eventually allows the U.S. to come to dominate the whole Western Hemisphere. So it's kind of like they're claiming the Americas for themselves. So anyway, that's the Monroe Doctrine, and we'll talk about that more later, but it basically just tells Europe to keep out of America. There are 4 big things that happened during Monroe's presidency, but we've only talked about a couple of them in this video. It was a time of American growth. American territory, population, and the economy are all expanding. 2, America steps out onto the world stage, feeling good about itself after 1812. It's able to basically set up a number of deals that force the old European countries to respect the USA, gaining territory from both Britain and Spain. And the Monroe Doctrine secures the Americas from European interference. Things that we're going to talk about next time are powerful nationalism begins to emerge. Basically, there's this feeling of national unity, and most Americans want for the nation to become stronger. That's more or less what nationalism is. But we also see the beginnings of sectionalism. And sectionalism is when different regions of the United States disagree on major political issues. And the major issue that they disagree about is the issue of slavery. So we're going to talk about 3 and 4 in the next few days. Thanks for paying attention. We're done for tonight. Here are your goals again, of course.